super I'm really excited to be able to be connected with this group. I feel like this is definitely a platform that I've been missing in my life, and so I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled that there's lots of people online that aren't just completely overwhelmed by the end of the semester. So I wanted to kind of give you a little history of how I got to this place where I'm thinking about this. I've been teaching at Furman for 25 years, and I am really, really lucky to have this job where I've basically been given carte blanche to do whatever I want, which is just incredible. And so probably 10 years ago, I proposed a philosophy of food class, and my chair said, absolutely, great, just if you're excited about it, the students will be excited about it, and that's what we want. And so I thought, we can't just teach a philosophy of food class in the classroom. And so I wanted a lab portion of it, where what ended up happening was that I was cooking with my students and the head chef from the university every week. And so we were able to connect what was going on in talking about food with what, actual cooking. Turns out also many of my students, I don't know if this is true of the generation or just my students, but terribly, terribly unskilled in the kitchen. I literally had to teach a kid how to use a can opener last week. And I was just horrified. But they're really, really unskilled. And so it's been a really interesting process for me in teaching this philosophy of food class and actually cooking and eating with them. The thing that came next was I was invited to lead a study away trip to Italy to teach about the slow food movement. And so I did that several times. And so I've been able to spend some time in Italy really thinking about the food and thinking about where it comes from and how their entire systems are different. And that led to this book, the Philosophy of Taste book, that came out a couple of years ago. And so I've been thinking about the aesthetic concept of taste, but then also really what it means to taste and to eat, and the gustatory end of taste, and what philosophers might be able to do with that. And of course, Carolyn, who's here, really introduced this topic to the aesthetics world with her book. Was it 1999? Was it that long ago? It was a while ago. Yes, but that was sort of everybody's real introduction to taste. So that book came out a couple years ago now, and in thinking about what my next steps were, I wanted to start thinking seriously about not just eating, but drinking. And so I've proposed another book that's called Drinking and Thinking. And what I want to do is look at 5 primary liquids that we consume that are stimulants. But I'm just going to limit it to coffee, tea, wine, beer, and liquor. And try to associate those 5 things with very particular movements in philosophy around the world. And so as I was thinking about this presentation, I wanted to start with wine. And so basically what that means is that I start with the ancient Greek philosophers. And I honestly just haven't gotten past them, because there's so much interesting stuff around wine for them. And I I'm going to have to really limit each liquid stimulant to a very particular place and a very particular time, because this history is not one that I learned in graduate school, is not one that we talk about when we read the Republic, is not one that I've ever sort of really focused on. But this discussion of how wine impacts the way that we think, and the way that we behave is actually talked about a good bit throughout many of the ancient Greek writings, and particularly in Plato, who's my favorite ancient Greek anyway. So I want to give like kind of a history of wine, but also a history of the way that the ancient Greeks thought about it. And so there's no sort of single instance of the discovery of wine. As far as I can tell, it's, you know, any sort of indication is that, you know, at least 20,000 BC, there was evidence of wine. But basically, wine has been around since rotting fruit on the ground has been around, and people would pick that up and eat it. There were instances of beehives that had honey in them that would have maybe fallen into a tree that had filled with water and, you know, sat for 3 days, and then somebody thought, yes, this is very good. So there's no sort of very specific point in time where, you know, we discovered it or invented it or it, you know, it became a thing. But fruit and water ferments, it sits around, and then very quickly, I think people discovered that makes me feel good. And this is a thing that I'm going to seek out. Okay. So we know that Dionysus, I have this nice AI photograph of Dionysus. This is what the most recent photographs of him look like. They're not nearly as excited. It's way more exciting than the ancient versions that we have. But he's, of course, the god of wine. And again, probably in what sort of records we have, one of the oldest gods going back to almost 12,000 BC. But so he's the god of wine, but also of wine making, of orchards and fruit, vegetation, fertility, festivity, insanity, ritual, madness, religious ecstasy, and theater. And so he shows up a lot in the ancient Greek literature. And in general, I think that there are 2 different kinds of stories that come up around Dionysus or Bacchus. These are the sort of the more ancient versions of pictures of him. But one of the kinds of stories that come up about Dionysus is one where people don't really recognize him for who he really is. And he ends up turning them into animals and then having them killed, right? Having them, you know, torn limb from limb. And the moral of this kind of story is that the wine is powerful and it's holy, and you need to be very, very clear about what it is that you're dealing with. And if you don't understand the power of the wine, you know, that you're really putting your life at risk. The second kind of story about Dionysus is actually what he does to teetotalers, or people that don't drink at all, people that choose not to drink. And he actually has a real mistrust of those people, because he doesn't think that if you're not willing to drink at all, then you can't be trusted, and that you've sort of been untested in a way, because should you drink, then we don't really know how you're going to react, and that he thinks that you should never turn down an invitation to drink, because you need to be able to show that you can handle yourself with alcohol. And interestingly, I think in the ancient Greek in the ancient Greek literature, there's not a lot of discussion of banning drunkenness or banning drinking, because you need this to be able to reveal character. And so in Plato's Laws, which is his longest and least read dialogue, I think, they do actually talk about banning it, but it's one of the only places that they do this that I could find. So, but the Greeks actually do. They talk a lot about drinking, and they talk a lot about how you're gonna make the rules about drinking, and how they're gonna enforce them. So the Athenians specifically, not just the Greeks, debated quite a bit about how drunk you're supposed to be and how you were supposed to behave after you've been drinking. For the Greeks, they didn't drink any beer, which is also, it existed again at this time in the 4th century BC. They only drank watered down wine. The Persians drank beer, and the Greeks said, "You are a barbarian. This is not right. You can't do that. No beer." The Thracians drank undiluted wine, and the Greeks said, "You are a barbarian. This is unacceptable. This is weird." And and of course the Greeks thought the way that we do it is right. This is the only possible way that you could do it. And so they really wanted to kind of figure out the best way to do it, and to record the best way to do it, and to actually have this put into deliberation, right? And so this was a question for deliberation, and the ancient Greeks were, of course, the sort of the founders of what we might call a deliberative society, where they're going to have regular conversations about all of the rules and regulations. That's not just sort of dictated by a ruler. They're going to have conversations and go back and forth. And so what they did was that they had these symposia, and where these are dinner parties, and I've learned quite a bit about these symposia in the last few weeks. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I think one of the important things for me was that I learned that Plato's Symposium, that everyone is familiar with, if they're familiar with any symposia at all, is not a typical symposium. And there were all kinds of things that happened there that were atypical of a symposium in ancient Greece. And so basically what would happen is that it would be a dinner party. There would be both men and women. They were typically at houses of the more wealthy people, and they would invite their wealthy friends. And of course, Socrates was not known to be wealthy, but he was one of the important voices at many of these parties. And so symposium, SYM, is the prefix to this, means together. Posia is the Greek for to drink, and so literally drinking together is what a symposium is. But the symposia were after the dinner party, and so where you sit and have a dinner, you're going to have a separate sort of occasion only for the men, in what was called the men's room. And this is where the symposia really were. And so what they would do is that they would lie on couches, like these, and they would be reclined, which is very important, and you were only allowed to recline fully as a man on one of these couches once you have killed your first boar, which now we know makes you a real man. And there were lots of there was entertainment, and there was music, and there were dancing girls, and there was, and there was what was called a symposiarch, who is basically the toastmaster, who's sort of in charge of the events. And so in addition to, so the symposiarch had quite a few jobs to do in these parties. So I'm going to show you a couple of these pictures. Let's see. So if you can see here, so this is just a close-up from the last picture, but the attendants would be reclined on their couches, and they would be holding these drinking vessels called kylics. And they were served from all of these. So there are these different, what they called craters, which were large drinking vessels, and all of the wine and the water would be mixed in these vessels. And if you've seen these sorts of things, this one here is called a bell crater, because it's shaped like a bell. And so this is one of the most common shapes. And what they would do is they would have these vessels that were the vessels to mix the water and the wine in, and then slave people would come and they would take the wine out of the big crater and put it into each individual kylics. And here you can see, the flute girl here, with someone's hand on her back. This one, this is actually, they're holding a kylics, an individual drinking bowl themselves here. Also, people had a tendency to get quite drunk. You can see here, this one is a man who's actually just vomiting, a slave helping him to throw up. And I just think, if this is really important enough to, draw on the side of a vase, this is something that would probably happen quite often. So in addition to the symposiarch being in charge of the wine, they would also be in charge of the conversation, and so or the order of events throughout the evening. And so the symposiarch would pose a question. We know that in Plato's Symposium, the question was about the nature of love. Xenophon's Symposia, which is the other one that we have sort of full evidence of, the question was actually, what are you most proud of? Which I think is a very different kind of conversation than one might happen in a Platonic dialogue, where they're trying to define things. But one of the things that was important for the symposiarch to do was to decide how strong the wine was going to be, and how much water would be mixed with the wine. And so typically it was water, sometimes seawater that had salt in it, that would change the taste of the wine. Sometimes it was diluted water, not from the sea with the salt. And sometimes there was honey added also. So they were at the party mixing the wine, but the host was going to decide how strong it would be. And so if you give wine that is too strong, everyone will get drunk really quick and the party will end early. And so the more diluted the wine is, the longer the party would go. And no one accidentally gets drunk at these parties, because you're not just handed a glass of wine and you can sip and it gets refilled. Everyone drinks, and no one gets a refill until everyone has finished their cup. And so the symposiarch is actually controlling the amount of alcohol that everybody is having. And so, where Socrates is very famous for, never being drunk, he is presumably sort of showing everyone his virtue in having complete control over his body, right? Whereas when everybody at a party is getting the exact same amount of alcohol, your character is going to reveal itself by how drunk you get. And so that was sort of his thing, where he's going to, that he's going to drink everyone under the table and stay sober at the end of the night. So there's a good bit of, there's criticism, I'll say, about other people that drink unmixed wine. I've just got a couple of things here, right? So the French were besotted with wine, which they drank unmixed and without a moderation. Plato criticizes the Scythians and the Thracians for drinking wine neat, which is exactly what we think of neat as, is just straight up, for regarding such behavior as a noble and splendid practice. An embassy returned from Persia is satirized by Aristophanes for having been obliged by their host to drink their wine unwatered. Herodotus blames the Scythians for the madness of Cleomenes, the Spartan king, who, having consorted with them, learned to drink unmixed wine and later killed himself, imprisoned by self-mutilation. So I think that there's evidence that there is discussion of this, and there is pretty wide judgment of making sure that you do it the right way. So then this is my last thing with text on it. So there's very particular ratios that we want to go for, and you want to drink either 5 or 3, or at least not 4. And the explanation of this is the 5 is to mix 3 cups of water with 2 of wine. So 3 to 2, 2 cups of water with 1 cup of wine, but not 3 cups of water with a single cup of wine, because that is just not enough wine. And they say that this is a portion that is sober and weak enough to be appropriate only for the magistrate or a logician, who must keep a clear head, which I think is a nice, very specific reference to people that need to keep their head clear. So a ration to 2 to 1 is sort of fine, but 3 to 2 is exactly the right amount. To sleep peaceably and to forget all your cares, stilling and appeasing all proud and disordered passions within the heart, inducing instead peaceable calm and tranquility. And so there is an exact proportion. I cannot imagine that the precision of the strength of the wine to begin with is anywhere near what we have and we think about. We know the volume of alcohol in every bottle before we even open it. I think there's probably a lot of variables that are still up for debate about how strong this is, but they really wanted to be careful about how strong it was, and it was never going to be, of course it wasn't bottled, it was carried around in large amphorae, and so it was pretty thick. And so the other thing that I think is really just delightful about these parties is that at the end of each bowl of wine, you get to play a drinking game. And this is the first legit beer pong, I think. katabos is a game that they would play, and you would take the your drinking vessel, like this one here, and you would fling the dregs of your wine at a goalpost, which was a bowl that would sit atop a stick in the middle of the room, and the person who was able to knock the bowl off with the dregs of their wine would win a prize. Again, this is sort of this is dictated by the symposiarch, and just crazy stuff. But this is a 19th century painting of what this might look like, where this person has his kylix right here. He's got the dancing girl maybe helping him, and this one is putting the bowl up atop this this decorated pole for him to aim to put whatever is at the bottom of his bowl into that stick again. And if he knocked it off, then he would be able to win some sort of prize, which would be probably more food, actually. There was, I read about a classics professor at a college in Pennsylvania recently who decided that she would try this with her class. And there's some photographs online, and basically she said it just got really messy and really sticky quite soon. And that was not something that people were very skilled at very quickly, and that they just ended up, flinging grape juice all over everywhere. For Plato, when he was talking about drunkenness and the soul, and how we want to see this, there are a number of different places throughout his dialogues that he talks about this. He talks about it in the Republic, of course, because we want to make sure that the people who are in charge are sober and make all the best decisions. He says the first time that you get drunk is kind of like going to the gym. You're going to be really sore, and you're really going to think that I don't want to do that anymore. But the more that you do it, the better you get at it. And so he really sort of encourages drinking so that you can begin to control. For those of you who have read the symposium, you might remember the discussion is that everyone is sort of hungover from the night before. And so some people choose not to drink. And this is why I said earlier, this is one of the things that sort of makes this an atypical symposium. But they are given the conversation topic for the night. And one of the things that he basically advocates there is that if you can drink alone or regularly and stay level-headed, you can show the world your virtue and the ways in which you can exert self-control when you're out drinking. And so this really did seem to be a thing that he thought that you should practice. So let's see, I've got, so this is one of the, so he actually talks mostly about drunkenness in the laws. And I think that it's one of the things that really is different about the laws than in the Republic is that in thinking about what it would be like to set up a brand new city, which they're actually doing in the laws, they start out with a question of drunkenness, right? There's not a question of what is justice or, how do we balance the soul? It's really, how are we going to regulate drunkenness is kind of where they start. And so they say, well, we have to have these festivals of Dionysus, and everybody should be getting drunk there because we have to praise Dionysus. But otherwise, we need to kind of stick to a different kind of moderation. And so in the laws, he actually he advocates for what he calls a drinking test. And basically he says by getting somebody drunk, you can kind of see what they're like. And he talks about all of these comparisons where he says, you know, if you want to see somebody, if we want to know what they're going to be like with money, rather than giving them a bunch of money and risking that, let's, you know, see what they're like drunk. Or he says, if we're going to talk about leadership, rather than putting somebody in charge of an entire army and seeing what they do, let's just get them drunk. And so he suggests here, but by getting someone drunk, that you can put their character to the test, to see what they're really like. And you don't have to really risk anything. You just go with them to the Festival of Dionysus and see what they do. And I think it's interesting because this is where sort of in the end for Plato, I mean, the laws being the end, what he says is that there's an element of truth that is revealed through drinking. And I think in the ways that we think, when we drink and we're becoming drunk, we lose our inhibitions, right? And we might say things that we might not otherwise say. At the same time, I might say things that I would never say while I was sober. And so it's not always just a clear revelation of true self, but it's something that for Plato seems to be a way to get true truth through real character. And again, I hadn't realized that there are all these references to the way that you would test it, or the way that you would practice drinking. And at the same time that Socrates would be this character that would never be drunk, right? But he was also never cold, right? He didn't need, you know, clothing in a cold weather. He would stop and think, and everybody else would get bored and they would sit down and they would say, oh my gosh, how long is he going to stand here thinking about something? But I think all three of these things are ways in which Socrates was held up as a character who had everything under control, body and soul, in such a way that you know, this was an ideal that was not explicit, but in the end, I think this is brought about by the way that they talk about alcohol. So getting back to the drinking and thinking, I think that this is going to be, for me, sort of a really nice introductory way of making sense of the role of alcohol in philosophy and in culture. So yeah, so that's what I've got.
Thank you so much.